The Ashen Key Murders, Part 1. Chapter 1. The Letter in the Fog. The thick London fog wrapped around the city like a morning veil, curling between the gas lamps and cobblestone streets. It was nearing midnight when Alistair Graves sat in his study at 221 Harrow Street, a cigar smoldering between his fingers, lost in thought. His companion, Dr. Jonathan Whitmore, was scribbling in his journal, documenting their last case, an affair involving stolen artifacts from the British Museum. A sharp knock echoed through the room. Graves lifted his head, eyes gleaming with curiosity. "Odd hour for a visitor," he murmured. Dr. Whitmore rose, but Graves gestured for him to sit. With a fluid motion, the detective retrieved a pistol from his drawer and approached the door. When he opened it, a cold gust rushed in, carrying the scent of damp streets and something more, a faint trace of iron, blood perhaps. A trembling young boy, no older than 10, stood there, his face pale as bone. He clutched an envelope in his small fingers. "Sir, are you Mr. Graves?" The boy stammered. "I am," Graves confirmed, studying the child with keen eyes. "And you are?" "I'm Thomas, sir. A man told me to deliver this." He hesitated. He said it's important, and that he didn't have much time. Graves took the envelope and noted the strange wax seal, a key burned into dark crimson wax. Something about it tickled the recesses of his mind, an old case perhaps, but he couldn't place it just yet. The boy hesitated before whispering, he also said. "The Ashen Key unlocks the grave." Graves' sharp gaze snapped to the boy. "Did he say anything else?" Thomas shook his head. "He just vanished into the fog." Graves flicked his wrist, opening the envelope. Inside, written in a shaky hand, were 6 words. "By dawn, the first will fall." The detective exhaled, a thrill coursing through him. A warning. A threat. A game had begun. Behind him, Whitmore leaned forward. "Graves, what is it?" The detective's lips curled into a knowing smirk. "It seems we have a case, Doctor. And a rather urgent one at that." He crushed the letter between his fingers, his mind already spinning with possibilities. Somewhere in the city, a murderer lurked, waiting for dawn to strike. And Alistair Graves would be waiting for them. Chapter 2. The First Murder, a Corpse with a Key. The city of London had barely begun to stir when Alistair Graves and Dr. Jonathan Whitmore arrived at the scene of the crime. The mist still clung to the streets, curling between gas lamps like spectral fingers, as the pair stepped from their handsome cab onto King's Passage, a narrow alley in Whitechapel. The street smelled of rain and refuse, but there was something else beneath it, a sickly metallic tang that only the experienced recognized. Blood. Graves moved forward with practiced ease, his eyes sweeping over the scene like a predator surveying its surroundings. A small group of constables stood near the entrance of the alley, their faces pale in the dim glow of a flickering street lamp. "Ah, Mr. Graves," Inspector Harold Finch greeted them, his mustache bristling as he exhaled sharply. "I was told you might be coming." Graves inclined his head. "And yet you look displeased, Inspector." "I prefer a case solved by hard police work rather than theatrics," Finch muttered. "But I'll not turn away a sharp mind, considering the circumstances." He gestured toward the alley. "A man was found dead not an hour ago. No identification, no apparent witnesses. But there's something peculiar." Graves stepped past Finch, Whitmore following at his side. They found the victim lying sprawled against the damp brick wall, his body twisted unnaturally. His throat had been cut, the wound deep and precise, no sign of struggle, no defensive wounds. It was efficient. Practiced. The man was dressed well, too well for Whitechapel, a dark woolen coat, polished boots, and a silver pocket watch still ticking in his waistcoat. This was no ordinary street murder. But it was what lay beside him that intrigued Graves most. A small iron key, its surface blackened as though burned, lay on the cobblestones beside the corpse's outstretched fingers. Graves knelt, lifting it carefully with a handkerchief. It was unmarked, save for a faint engraving on its head, an ashen key, matching the wax seal on the letter he had received hours before. His mind was already at work, fitting pieces of the puzzle together. The message had warned, "By dawn, the first will fall." This man was the first. "Doctor," Graves murmured, rising to his feet. "Your thoughts?" Whitmore crouched, examining the corpse with medical precision. "The wound is clean, no hesitation. This was done by someone who knew exactly what they were doing. A professional, perhaps an assassin." He pressed a gloved hand to the man's wrist. "Body is still warm. Time of death, less than an hour ago." Graves turned to Finch. Who found him? One of the local boys, street urchin named Jack, Finch said. Swears he saw a figure disappearing into the mist just as he arrived. He couldn't describe much, tall, dark coat, but he thought the man was whistling. Whistling. Whitmore frowned. Odd behavior for a murderer. Or deliberate, Graves mused. A taunt, perhaps? He gestured toward the victim. No robbery, no struggle. This was planned. He was waiting for this man. And he left this key as a message. Finch grunted. To whom? Graves turned the key over in his hand. To me. Silence fell between them. Even Finch seemed unsettled by the notion. Inspector, Graves continued, slipping the key into his coat pocket, I need to know everything about this man. His movements, his associates, his purpose here tonight. Finch sighed. We'll check his pockets for papers. If he has a name, we'll find it. And the key? Whitmore asked. Graves turned toward the alley's entrance, his mind already racing ahead. This key unlocks something important. Something our killer wants us to find. His gaze darkened. Or something he wants us to fear. Without another word, Alistair Graves strode into the London fog, the first piece of the mystery clutched tightly in his gloved hand. The game had begun. Chapter 3. A Visitor at Midnight. The gas lamps outside 221 Harrow Street flickered weakly against the ever-present London fog, their glow barely reaching the cobblestone street below. Inside, Alistair Graves sat in his armchair, twirling the blackened key between his fingers. The parlor was dim, save for the golden light of the fireplace casting long shadows against the walls. Across from him, Dr. Jonathan Whitmore leaned forward, elbows on his knees, deep in thought. The events of the night had left them with more questions than answers. The victim's identity? Whitmore asked. Graves tapped the key against the armrest. Still unknown. Finch's men found no papers on him. He wasn't robbed, and he was dressed far too well for a casual wanderer in Whitechapel. Whitmore frowned. Then he was there for a reason. Perhaps he was meeting someone? Graves exhaled slowly, watching the embers shift in the hearth. Or lured. The letter warned that the first will fall. It suggests more deaths to follow. This isn't a single crime, but the beginning of something larger. The detective reached for a small, leather-bound book on the table beside him, flipping through its pages. His personal collection of unsolved mysteries. His finger traced over a familiar name, the Ashen Key Society. He had encountered the name years ago, whispered in the opium dens and back alleys of London, always spoken in hushed, fearful tones. A secretive order, rumored to control powerful men from the shadows. Their symbol? A blackened key, much like the one now resting in his palm. A knock at the door shattered the silence. Both men exchanged a glance. It's nearly midnight, Whitmore murmured. A little late for visitors. Graves rose, retrieving his revolver from the side table. He moved toward the door with quiet precision and peered through the small peephole. A hooded figure stood on the other side, shrouded in the thick mist. Graves hesitated only a moment before unlocking the door. The visitor stepped inside quickly, pulling back the hood to reveal the face of a woman, her sharp cheekbones and piercing dark eyes framed by raven black hair. She was breathless, as if she had been running. Mr. Graves, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. You're in great danger. Graves shut the door behind her, studying her with his usual detached scrutiny. She was dressed finely but not ostentatiously, her hands trembling slightly as she removed her gloves. And you are? He asked. She hesitated before answering. Eleanor Blackwood. Whitmore's brow furrowed. The name sounds familiar. Graves nodded slightly. The daughter of Victor Blackwood, the shipping magnate who vanished 6 years ago. Eleanor's lips pressed into a thin line. My father didn't vanish, Mr. Graves. He was taken. Graves set his revolver down but did not relax. And why come to me now? She took a deep breath. Because the man killed tonight, the one you found, was my father's business partner. She paused, her voice tightening. And because I know what the Ashen Key means. The room fell silent. Graves leaned forward, his gaze locked onto hers. Then you know more than most. Eleanor hesitated again, clearly battling with something within herself. Finally, she spoke. The Ashen Key is not just a symbol. It is an invitation. Whitmore looked at Graves, puzzled. An invitation to what? Eleanor exhaled, her fingers tightening into fists. A society older than the city itself. A secretive order of men who deal in power, influence, and death. Those who receive the Ashen Key are either chosen or marked for execution. Graves' fingers brushed over the key in his palm. And which was our victim? She met his gaze. Marked. Whitmore inhaled sharply. Then that means, before he could finish, the lamps flickered. A low creak sounded from outside the study. Someone was in the house. Graves reacted instantly, drawing his revolver as he moved toward the doorway. Eleanor took a step back, fear flashing across her face. Whitmore grabbed the poker from the fireplace, his muscles tensing. A shadow shifted in the hallway beyond. Graves moved swiftly, pressing against the wall before stepping into the dark corridor. His sharp eyes adjusted quickly. The faint outline of a figure stood near the back entrance, poised like a specter in the night. "Step forward," Graves commanded, his voice calm but edged with steel. The figure hesitated. Then, with a sudden burst of movement, it turned and fled. Graves fired a single shot, aiming for the leg, but his target was fast, disappearing into the alley beyond before the bullet could find its mark. Silence fell once more. Graves exhaled, lowering his revolver. He turned back toward the study, where Eleanor and Whitmore stood frozen in place. "Someone was listening," he said quietly. Eleanor's voice was barely above a whisper. "They know I'm here." Graves slipped the ashen key into his pocket, his mind working at lightning speed. The game had escalated. Whoever was behind this was watching his every move. And now, they knew Eleanor Blackwood had spoken. He turned to her, his expression unreadable. "You said the ashen key is an invitation. Tell me, Miss Blackwood, how does one accept it?" Her lips parted, but before she could answer, the grandfather clock in the hall struck midnight. And somewhere in London, another victim was about to fall. Chapter 4. The Whispers of Whitechapel. The heavy toll of the grandfather clock reverberated through 221, Harrow Street, marking midnight. Outside, the London fog had thickened, pressing against the windows like a ghostly presence. Alistair Graves stood in the doorway of his study, his revolver still in hand. The intruder had vanished into the night, but their message was clear: someone was watching. Behind him, Eleanor Blackwood sat in the chair opposite the fireplace, her face pale but composed. Dr. Jonathan Whitmore remained standing near the hearth, still gripping the fireplace poker. Graves turned to Eleanor. "You were about to tell me. How does one accept the Ashen Key's invitation?" Eleanor hesitated before speaking. "There is an initiation," she said softly. "A ritual. Those chosen are given a time and place. They are expected to follow the instructions precisely." "And if they don't?" Whitmore asked. She looked at him, her eyes dark with meaning. "Then they are never seen again." Graves crossed the room, placing his revolver back on the side table. He retrieved the blackened key from his pocket, holding it between two fingers as he examined it under the light. The metal was rough, scorched, as if it had been burned in a fire. "You believe this key was meant for the victim?" Graves asked. Eleanor nodded. If he had it, then he was either about to attend the initiation, or he had already failed the test. Graves' mind worked quickly. Then that means two things. First, there are others who were chosen. And second, his voice darkened. Someone is ensuring they never make it. Whitmore set the poker down, rubbing his temple. "Then what exactly is this society? What do they do?" Eleanor's voice was almost a whisper. "They control things, doctor. Politics. Business. Even the police. The Ashen Key Society operates in the shadows, shaping the city as they see fit. Those who enter their circle gain access to wealth and influence beyond imagination, but there is a price." Graves narrowed his eyes. "What kind of price?" Eleanor hesitated. "A test. A proof of loyalty. Sometimes it is a task, sometimes an act of sacrifice. But failure means death." Whitmore exhaled sharply. "And your father? Was he part of this?" Eleanor's hands clenched in her lap. He was drawn into it. He thought it was just another business alliance at first. Then he realized what it truly was. He tried to leave. Her voice broke slightly. "That was 6 years ago. He disappeared, and I never saw him again." Silence hung in the room. Graves studied Eleanor carefully. He had seen many liars in his time, but this woman was not one of them. Her fear was real. He set the key down on the table. "You came here for a reason, Miss Blackwood. Not just to warn me." She swallowed hard. "I need your help, Mr. Graves. I believe the society is hunting down its own members. And I believe I may be next." Graves exchanged a glance with Whitmore. The doctor's face was skeptical, but his concern was evident. "You have proof of this?" Graves asked. Eleanor nodded. "Not proof. But I have a name, a man who might know more. A former member. If anyone can tell us why this is happening, it's him. Graves folded his arms. And who is he? She exhaled. His name is Sebastian Wolf. Whitmore tensed. Wolf? As in the former chief inspector of Scotland Yard? Eleanor nodded. He was a member once, but he left. Or so he claims. He lives in Whitechapel now, drinking away whatever secrets he carries. Graves smiled faintly. A fallen man with nothing to lose. I rather like those types. He grabbed his coat and hat from the stand. Come, doctor. We're going to Whitechapel. Whitmore sighed heavily. Why do I feel I won't like what we find? Graves smirked. Because you never do. Whitechapel, 1:15 a.m. The streets of Whitechapel were nearly deserted at this hour, save for the occasional beggar huddled against a doorway or the distant laughter of a drunken patron spilling from an alleyway tavern. The scent of unwashed bodies, rotting food, and cheap gin clung to the fog. Graves and Whitmore moved through the winding streets, their coats pulled tightly against the damp chill. Behind them, Eleanor followed closely, her face partially obscured by her hood. Their destination was a crumbling boarding house on the edge of the district, a place where former officers, criminals, and men with no future came to drown themselves in cheap liquor. Graves knocked once, then twice. After a long pause, the door creaked open. A hunched, bearded man peered out, his eyes bloodshot and sunken. Go away, he muttered. Sebastian Wolf? Graves asked. The man's hand twitched slightly. He attempted to shut the door, but Graves was faster, wedging his cane between the frame and stepping forward. You have something I need, the detective said smoothly. Wolf glared at him. I've got nothing for you, Graves. Whitmore blinked. You know who he is? The ex-inspector gave a dry, humorless laugh. Everyone in the yard knows Graves. Man pokes his nose where it doesn't belong. How fortunate for you, Graves said, pushing past him into the dimly lit room. The place smelled of stale sweat and whiskey. Papers were scattered across the floor. A half-empty bottle of gin rested on the table beside a loaded revolver. Wolf slumped into a chair. You don't want to be here, he muttered. It's not safe. Eleanor stepped forward. We need answers. About the society. Wolf went still. I don't know what you're talking about, he said, but the tremor in his voice betrayed him. Graves sat across from him. The Ashen Key, Wolf. A man was murdered tonight. He had this. He placed the blackened key on the table. You know what it means, don't you? Wolf's jaw tightened. He grabbed the bottle of gin and took a long swig before slamming it down. You need to leave, he whispered. Graves leaned in. Who is behind the killings? Wolf's hand twitched toward his revolver. Graves tensed, ready to move. But then Wolf exhaled, rubbing a hand down his face. You don't understand, Graves. This is bigger than any of us. Eleanor pressed forward. My father. Wolf cut her off with a sharp look. Your father was a fool, Miss Blackwood. He thought he could escape. He thought there was a way out. He glanced at the key on the table. There isn't. Silence fell. Graves picked up the key, twirling it between his fingers. Perhaps not for some, but I have never been particularly fond of closed doors. Wolf gave a bitter chuckle. Then you're already dead, Graves. Outside, the distant tolling of a bell rang through the fog. And somewhere in Whitechapel, a second body hit the ground. Chapter 5, The Man with the Golden Eye. The chilling toll of the distant bell sent a ripple through the damp, smoke-filled room. Sebastian Wolf stiffened in his chair, his fingers tightening around the half-empty bottle of gin. Alistair Graves didn't move, but his sharp eyes flicked toward the fogged window. The sound had come from no more than a few streets away. Another murder. Another body. Dr. Jonathan Whitmore sighed heavily, rubbing his temple. We barely began speaking with Wolf, and already the killer has struck again. Eleanor Blackwood turned pale. This is what I feared. It's happening faster now. Graves stood, brushing dust from his coat. Then we haven't a moment to waste. He turned to Wolf, who was still gripping his bottle like a lifeline. Tell me what you know, Wolf. This is the second victim tonight. The pattern will only continue. Wolf exhaled shakily. I warned you, Graves. You don't want to be in this. Graves stepped forward, his voice low and deliberate. And yet here I am. Wolf studied the detective for a long moment. Then, with a curse, he threw back a final swig of gin before slamming the bottle onto the table. The Ashen Key Society doesn't just choose people, he muttered. They own them. Those invited either serve or they die. Eleanor flinched, but Graves remained impassive. And the victims? Wolf's jaw clenched. They're not random, if that's what you're thinking. The society only eliminates those who betray them, or those who learn too much. Graves met his gaze. Like you. The ex-inspector's face twitched. He let out a dry, mirthless chuckle. No, Graves. I wasn't important enough. I was just a watchdog. They let me leave with my life, so long as I stayed silent. His voice dropped. But the others? The ones dying now? They weren't so lucky. Eleanor stepped forward. And my father? Wolf sighed. Your father wanted to burn it all down, Miss Blackwood. He thought he could expose them. His lips curled bitterly. But he never understood what he was dealing with. He was already dead the moment he turned against them. A tense silence settled over the room. Then, finally, Graves spoke. And who was next? Wolf didn't answer immediately. He stared at the tabletop as though weighing the cost of his words. Then he whispered, a man named Isaac Mercer. Whitmore frowned. Who is he? A banker, Wolf muttered. One of the society's money men. I overheard his name in a meeting long ago. He helped fund them. Eleanor inhaled sharply. And now they're turning on him? Graves pocketed the blackened key, his mind racing. Then Mercer is the next target. And if he dies before we reach him, we'll lose our best lead. He turned sharply to Wolf. Where can I find him? The ex-inspector hesitated. He owns an estate in Mayfair. But that's not where he'll be tonight. Wolf swallowed. He'll be at the Gilded Hand. Whitmore's brow furrowed. The gambling club? Wolf nodded grimly. It's not just a club, Doctor. It's a meeting ground for the society's members. His voice dropped to a near whisper. And if Mercer is there tonight, it may already be too late. The Gilded Hand, 2 a.m. The handsome cab rattled through the streets of Mayfair, its wheels slick from the damp roads. Graves sat across from Eleanor and Whitmore, his hands clasped in thought. The Gilded Hand is an exclusive establishment, Whitmore said. Surely they won't just let us walk in. Graves smirked. Doctor, I do hope you know me better than that. As the carriage came to a stop, the detective stepped out, smoothing his coat. The Gilded Hand was unlike the other clubs in London. There were no signs, no advertisements, only a grand set of dark wooden doors, guarded by two well-dressed men. High society's most dangerous secrets were bought and sold here, hidden beneath the guise of high-stakes gambling. Eleanor pulled her hood over her head, trying to conceal her identity. Are you certain about this? Graves turned to her. No, but certainty has never been my profession. With that, he strode forward. The guards tensed as he approached, but before they could speak, Graves produced something from his pocket, an ivory poker chip engraved with a golden eye. One of the guards eyed it, then nodded silently. Without a word, they stepped aside. Whitmore raised a brow. And where, exactly, did you acquire that? Graves merely smiled. I have my ways. The doors creaked open, and they stepped inside. The club was a den of smoke, whispers, and deception. Crystal chandeliers cast golden light over velvet-draped tables, where London's wealthiest men wagered fortunes under the gaze of unseen masters. Waiters moved between them, pouring fine brandy into crystal glasses, while a string quartet played a slow, haunting melody. Graves moved with purpose, his sharp eyes scanning the room. Somewhere among these men was Isaac Mercer. A familiar voice murmured beside him. You should not be here, Mr. Graves. He turned. A tall, silver-haired man in an elegant suit stood nearby, watching him with cold amusement. One eye gleamed golden under the candlelight, a polished glass replacement. Graves smiled thinly. Ah, Lucian Thorne. Whitmore tensed. You know him. Eleanor whispered urgently, he's one of them. Graves inclined his head. A founding member of the Ashen Key Society, if I recall. Thorne smirked. Clever as always, Graves. He gestured toward the club. Enjoying the entertainment? Graves returned the smirk. Merely looking for a friend. Isaac Mercer. Thorne's expression didn't change, but something in his posture shifted. I'm afraid you're too late, he murmured. Graves' eyes narrowed. What do you mean? Thorne took a sip of his brandy, then gestured toward the far side of the room. At the very back of the club, seated at a lavish card table, was a man in a black suit. He was slumped forward, face down on the green felt. The players around him remained silent, their expressions blank. The dealer continued shuffling, as if nothing had happened. Whitmore exhaled sharply. Dear God, Graves stepped forward, but Thorne caught his arm. I wouldn't, he said smoothly. Graves' gaze flicked to the dead man. Even from here, he could see the small, blackened key resting beside the fallen glass of brandy. A message. Another body. Thorne's golden eye gleamed. "You should leave, Mr. Graves." His voice was barely above a whisper. "Before they decide to send you a key of your own." Chapter 6. A coded message in blood. The opulence of the gilded hand had turned grotesque. The dead man slumped over the gaming table. A once powerful financier, Isaac Mercer, had met his end while London's elite continued their wagers as though nothing had happened. A fresh corpse among the clinking glasses and shuffled cards. Alistair Graves knew this wasn't just another execution. It was a warning. The blackened key resting beside Mercer's drink confirmed it. Whoever was orchestrating these deaths was leaving breadcrumbs, daring him to follow. Across from him, Lucian Thorne, the silver-haired gentleman with the golden eye, watched him carefully. The man's lips curled into a slight smirk, but his gaze remained calculating. "You were too late, Graves," Thorne murmured. His voice was quiet, too smooth. A shame. Mercer was such an interesting player. Graves ignored him, stepping forward, deliberately slow, to examine the body. Mercer's face was slack, his eyes half-lidded, mouth slightly ajar. No visible wounds. No sign of a struggle. A half-finished glass of brandy rested near his fingers. Whitmore muttered, "Poison." Graves tilted the glass, sniffing the contents. "Possibly." He reached into his coat, pulling out a small vial of reagent powder, and tapped a few grains into the liquid. It bubbled, turned murky green. "Cyanide," Whitmore said grimly. "Fast-acting." He wouldn't have had time to call for help. Eleanor Blackwood stepped closer, her hood pulled low, her face pale. She glanced around at the other patrons, who continued pretending they hadn't just witnessed a murder. "Why is no one reacting?" she whispered. Graves answered without looking up. "Because the only ones who come to the Gilded Hand know when to keep their mouths shut." Thorne chuckled softly. "Quite right." Graves' sharp eyes flicked to him. "You knew he would die tonight, didn't you?" Thorne swirled his own glass of brandy lazily. "Speculation, Graves. Nothing more." Graves straightened. He was done with games. He turned his attention back to Mercer's corpse. Carefully, he tilted the body forward, examining the fine fabric of his waistcoat, the crease of his shirt. Then he saw it. A marking beneath the folds of Mercer's shirt. Not a scar. Not a bruise. A message. Graves unbuttoned the dead man's waistcoat. Across his bare chest, written in blood, were 4 cryptic symbols. Whitmore's breath hitched. "Is that writing?" Graves stared at the symbols, his mind racing. "Not exactly. It's a cipher." Eleanor swallowed. "What does it mean?" Graves studied the pattern, his fingers tracing the air above the strange markings. "Each symbol corresponds to an old cryptographic key," he murmured. "These aren't letters. They're coordinates." Whitmore frowned. "Coordinates? To what?" Graves exhaled. "A location." A beat of silence. Then Lucian Thorne laughed. Graves turned to him sharply. "Something amusing?" Thorne's golden eye glinted in the low light. "Oh, Graves. Always the hound, always chasing a scent." He set down his glass. "But you must know by now, when you follow the Ashen Key's trail," his voice darkened. "It only leads to Graves." Graves held his stare, unshaken. "Then it's fortunate I have no fear of the dead." Without another word, he reached into his coat, pulled a small notebook, and began translating the symbols. His pen moved quickly, converting each arcane marking into something recognizable. Latitude and longitude. Then he stopped. His grip on the pen tightened. Eleanor peered over his shoulder. "What is it?" Graves glanced up, his expression unreadable. "The coordinates," he murmured. "They point to Highgate Cemetery." Highgate Cemetery, 3:15 a.m. The iron gates of Highgate Cemetery loomed like the jaws of a beast, silhouetted against the pale glow of the gas lamps. The moment the cab dropped them off, a chill seeped into the air, unnatural for a London spring. Graves stood at the threshold, his hands deep in his coat pockets. Whitmore exhaled sharply, his breath curling in the cold. "Of all the places I hoped to be at 3 in the morning, this was not one of them." Eleanor pulled her cloak tighter. "Why would Mercer's body have led us here?" Graves' eyes scanned the entrance. "Only one way to find out." He pushed open the iron gate, the rusted hinges groaning in protest. Beyond it, rows of weathered tombstones and statues stretched into the darkness. Marble angels, their faces worn by time, stood in silent vigil. The 3 of them stepped cautiously onto the gravel path. The night was too still, even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Then a sound. A faint scraping, somewhere deeper inside the cemetery. Graves raised a hand, signaling silence. Whitmore and Eleanor froze. Another scrape. A shuffle of footsteps. They weren't alone. Graves gestured for them to move slowly, and the three made their way past towering mausoleums, their shadows stretching under the moonlight. Then, a flicker of movement. Near an overgrown tomb, a dark figure stood hunched over, digging into the soil. Graves narrowed his eyes. A gravedigger? No, someone else. Then, as if sensing their presence, the figure snapped upright. The moonlight caught his face, half hidden behind a tattered scarf, but revealing sharp, haunted eyes. The man's fingers clutched something in the dirt. Something small. Metal. Graves tensed. The man had just unearthed another blackened key. For a long, tense moment, neither party moved. Then the stranger bolted. After him, Graves barked. They raced after the fleeing figure, dodging crumbling headstones, chasing him deeper into the cemetery. The man was fast, darting between crypts like a shadow, his feet barely making a sound. Graves lunged forward just as the figure reached the outer fence. He grabbed the man's coat, yanking him back. The stranger spun and lashed out with a knife. Graves barely dodged, the blade slicing the air inches from his throat. The man was skilled, desperate, but Graves was faster. With a sharp twist, he drove his cane into the stranger's knee, sending him crashing to the ground. Whitmore and Eleanor caught up, breathless. The man lay sprawled in the dirt, panting. The scarf fell away, revealing a gaunt, terrified face. Graves knelt beside him. "You were digging for the key," he murmured. "Why?" The man's wide, bloodshot eyes met his. Then he whispered, voice hoarse, "Because I don't want to die." Chapter 7. The Club of the Forgotten. The man's breath came in ragged gasps, his chest heaving from exhaustion. He lay sprawled in the dirt of Highgate Cemetery, half covered in grime, his trembling fingers still clutching the blackened key he had unearthed. Alistair Graves loomed over him, his sharp gaze cutting through the dark. Dr. Jonathan Whitmore knelt beside the stranger, checking for injuries. Eleanor Blackwood stood close, her hood drawn, her eyes filled with wary curiosity. The man was gaunt, his cheekbones sharp beneath the moonlight, his clothes tattered as though he had been running for days. But what stood out most was the sheer terror in his eyes. Graves spoke first, his voice low and deliberate. "Start talking." The man swallowed hard, his fingers still wrapped around the blackened key. His voice was hoarse, cracking like dry parchment. "You don't understand," he gasped. I wasn't digging for it. I was hiding it." Whitmore frowned. "Hiding it? From who?" The man shuddered, his gaze darting over his shoulder as if something lurked in the shadows. "The ones who gave it to me." Graves' jaw tightened. "The Ashen Key Society." The stranger gave a weak nod. "They sent me a key. Just like Mercer. Just like the others." He licked his cracked lips. "I knew what it meant. I knew. I wouldn't survive." Eleanor spoke softly. "So you tried to bury it. To refuse their invitation." The man laughed bitterly, but there was no humor in it. "You don't refuse them. You can run, you can hide, you can throw the key into the sea. It doesn't matter." His voice dropped into a whisper. "They always find you." A heavy silence settled over them. Even Whitmore, usually the skeptic, looked unsettled. Graves studied the man for a moment before asking the only question that mattered. "What do they want from you?" The man's eyes filled with something close to madness. "They want me to kill." Whitmore inhaled sharply. "What?" The man's hands curled into fists, his whole body trembling. "That's what the final test is. When they send you the key, it means they've chosen you. But you're not safe yet. You have to prove yourself. You have to do what they say." His voice wavered. "You have to take a life." Eleanor whispered, "And if you don't?" The man gave her a hollow look. "Then they take yours instead." Graves exhaled slowly, turning the key over in his gloved fingers. "So this is how they choose their members," he murmured. "An initiation by blood." The stranger clutched Graves' sleeve. "Please. You have to help me. I can't do it. I can't kill someone. But they're watching. They know I tried to hide the key. They—" A gunshot shattered the night. The man jerked violently, a dark red bloom spreading across his chest. His grip slackened. His eyes, wide with shock, fixed on something unseen. Then he slumped backward. "Dead." Eleanor screamed. Whitmore ducked, pulling her behind a crumbling mausoleum. Graves spun, his revolver already in hand, scanning the darkened cemetery for the shooter. Silence. No movement. But someone was there. Watching. Waiting. Graves' mind worked fast. The killer was a professional. A single, precise shot. No hesitation. The bullet had come from the treetops beyond the fence. A sniper. Whoever had executed the man had never intended for him to escape. Graves gritted his teeth. Another loose end, tied up in blood. Whitmore pressed his hand against Eleanor's back, steadying her. We need to get out of here. Graves kept his revolver raised, scanning the treetops. But he knew the assassin was already gone. With a final glance at the body, he slipped the blackened key from the dead man's fingers and pocketed it. The society had sent a message. They were watching.
Every mystery leaves a mark. And the next case is already unfolding. If you enjoyed the story, subscribe, like, and share. There are more secrets waiting to be uncovered. Join us in the next chapter of A Study in Secrets.